Welcome to episode 8 of the Radical Narrative Podcast. I'm your host, Mylan Tutusis. Today we're going to be talking about treaty nationhood and nation-to-nation agreements. This is specific to Treaty 1 to 11, a very specific geopolitical context in North America. And our guest today to help us unpack this is Jason Mercredi. Jason Mercredi is from Treaty 5 territory, Misipawistik Cree Nation. Aside from being an Indigenous person who's heard these narratives growing up, he's also trained as a lawyer. However, he chose not to write the bar exam because he felt it would be a compromise on his Indigenous nationhood. There's tons of important information in this podcast, so stay tuned and listen in. Can you introduce yourself, who you are and where you come from?
Okay, yeah. Jason Mercredi, Indigenous Nationhood, and I'm from my ancestral lineage is from Misipawistik Cree Nation. The grandson of Louise Mercredi and proud son of former National Chief Ovid Mercredi.
And what do you do?
I currently work for TFAO Inc. It's the project office for the Summit of Treaty 5 Sovereign Nations. We get all of our direction and marching orders from the Summit of Treaty 5 Sovereign Nations. And the Summit of Treaty 5 Sovereign Nations is every Indigenous member of Treaty 5.
What type of work are you doing in this organization that you're involved with?
So what we try to do is remove ourselves from the Indian Act to restore our own governance systems, to restore our sovereignty, and practice that sovereignty. But we do it in a way that we're not imposing neocolonialism on our own communities. So what we try to do is listen to everybody in the community who has an opinion about something or a viewpoint or maybe an idea for a direction, and we consider that in the way that we understand our pre-colonial government structures to be, which is consensus-wise.
Yeah, and you said something really interesting just now where you said pre-colonial governance structures, and that's something I want to tap into with this podcast is have a conversation about our Indigenous nationhood, our treaty governance, and what we were actually trying to achieve as a political, peaceful, diplomatic, and friendship project with settlers. And we'll unpack some of that later. But tell me about your upbringing and where you grew up.
I grew up a little bit in Winnipeg and mostly Toronto area. I got to travel a lot, and so I guess for the first part of my life, I guess I didn't really identify. I knew I was quite like what they call Indian, but I never really had a connection to the culture through that. Not until I turned early teenage years, and then obviously being raised by my father, being raised to believe in sovereignty was something that was always a consistent lesson in my life. You know. Like anytime we heard anything about Canada has done this for First Nations people, my dad would be there to tell me the truth about that situation. Like, oh, we gave them $100 million for housing. And then he'd be there to sit down with me and be like, okay, well, let's do the math on that. So 500 million, 600 reserves, that's about 1 million per reserve. And it costs about 200,000 to build a house, or maybe 125 to get a trailer up there. Out of that 1 million, that's maybe 10 houses, more like 8 houses, but the community needs 15 or 20 houses. So really, how is that a generous deal, you know? And then when you compare what they call generosity back to the treaty, it's really just a treaty fulfillment. It's not generosity.
Yeah, those treaty fulfillments, and we'll have conversations about that because that's a really important context you're highlighting, just these equations that need to exist between us and the settler state and the treaty dynamic. That's really important. I followed you on social media and I was noticing your posts and your commentary, your political commentary is really on point and really speaks to me too, because where I grew up, Treaty 6 territory, nationhood and sovereignty, our Indigenous governance was really primary in a lot of the conversations we had growing up around the dinner table. And I noticed that you had the similar commentary in some of the things you share. And we're going to have a conversation about this, and complete disclaimer to our audience. We're going to talk about this in our own way, the best way we know how, using words that some people may not agree with. I know there's a lot of tone policing and there's a lot of legalese involved in these conversations, but we're going to go ahead and have this public conversation anyway because people need to hear it. And you also highlighted, because we had a conversation before this, where you highlighted that you have a unique upbringing in terms of having to navigate the urban spaces and the urban centers, but you also connected to your family to help you navigate the political conversations that we'll ultimately be having here today.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's what I was saying. I was born in Winnipeg, so I'm back in Winnipeg now, back in my official hometown. But I never. My ancestral lineage is from Misipawistik Cree Nation, grandson of Louise Mercredi. But I never lived on the reserve, so I don't have that living on the reserve kind of experience. Seen enough, but still not enough to, like, we're not going to be a poser about it, right? I grew up mostly in metropolitan areas, but at an early age, around pre-teen years, I started really getting into what my identity as an Indigenous person was, and that's hard to do in cityscapes, because either you're going to a friendship center or some organization that has various nations doing various nation teachings, right? So it's hard to get a specific, especially in Toronto area. It was like you got Mohawk people sharing Anishinaabe stories, or Cree people sharing Anishinaabe stories, and it gets muddled sometimes. So just like defining what your culture is, I've always turned back to my family for that.
Yeah, and there is sort of like a pan-Aboriginalism or a pan-indigeneity that sometimes takes the forefront in a lot of people's conversations and how they position themselves.
I mean, it's beneficial for sure, because you can see the similarities between all of our cultures. I think the main similarity, though, is, well, the one undeniable similarity between all First Nations in Canada would be their governance structures. Like we all fall under the Indian Act now, and that's the exceptionally oppressive system, right? And we all want to, like, I haven't met any First Nation governance systems, or any bands, I guess was what they call them, and I haven't met any that say, no, we're happy under the Indian Act, we like it, it's good, Canada takes care of us. It's problematic because we keep running to Canada for like solutions, etc. And we're not really turning to Canada saying, we have these treaties. We don't need to ask you. You need to step up and start putting more on our plate, because that's what we assigned to, that's what we agreed to do.
And yeah, you highlighted something interesting where you said specifically that you did grow up in like the metropolitan center, the urban centers, and it is true that there is almost like a pan-Aboriginal or pan-Indigenous culture that does exist. And yeah, there's pros and cons to that for sure, like you're highlighting. But then also one dynamic that exists too is that sometimes when we're in those spaces or young people are navigating at that stage in their life, they're also fed like the Canadian identity. And they're fed like the Canadian political system and the melting pot theory, or whatever it's called, multiculturalism in Canada. And then sometimes they buy into that. So sometimes they actually buy into like being a Canadian and then choose to invest in the political, social, and even economic culture of Canada, which in my eyes is settler colonial.
Oh, absolutely. And it's not any different than the strategy they put in place when they created the Enfranchisement Act. Right? Like early 18th century, they had this idea that the only good Indian was going to be a civilized Indian, who was going to identify the way that we identify, have the same beliefs, have the same education. For God's sakes, if an Indigenous person wanted to become a doctor, they had to sit in front of a panel of non-Indigenous doctors. This is like back in the 18th, 19th century. They had to sit in front of a panel and explain to them how white they were.
Yeah, and like in many ways, that kind of system and approach still works today and is still in play today in some cases, in some disciplines and systems.
That's been such a consistent brainwashing strategy that, yeah, you're right. When we get to the city, we have to adapt. We don't have, most reserves don't have as many markets as a small town. And then we fall into this trap of like, oh, well, this is the way it is. This is the way it's supposed to be. And no education system that I've been through has really done a diligent job on teaching what the treaties are. Then when our Indigenous when our youth get into the city, and like, think about it, it's the same thing as residential schools. Who's their support system? Who's around them? Right? They might have family, but so much was lost in the early 19th century that we're like our languages, for instance, right? We lost so much of that through residential schools that people became afraid to speak it. Our culture was made illegal for around 50 years, potlatch laws and whatnot, which they interpreted to mean indigenous culture. We were always under the power of some Indian agent who was going to depict the behavior of our women and depict the behavior of our people and act as judge and jury whenever they felt we were out of line with their system. So then, we get into the city and either we don't want to be there or nothing about us really exists.
Yeah. And then, what you're saying is true when you were talking about how like even the education system doesn't really bring into the classroom our narratives of nationhood and our narratives of who we are, even politically. Like even the assumption today is that we don't have a political culture, we don't have a system of governance, therefore we have to partake in the settler colonial political structure.
Well, that was a whole interpretation of being the uncivilized savage, right? Because we didn't structure our governance systems the way they did, and because we honored our women and the roles and powers that they had within our communities, and they didn't have any roles for the women. They didn't have roles for the women until around 1960. So here's this very egotistical nation, I guess we call them that. Let's just call them racist. These racist people came in and said, we're the right, we know the way, and you guys aren't doing it our way, so you obviously don't know how you manage it. But when you dig deeper into what our governance structures were, in this area anyway, we learned that we had annual gatherings and nations would come from all over, and we would all, sit around together, share ceremonies, share stories, and talk about what's going to happen with herds or lands or migrations, different patterns, right? Like who's hunting in this area and can we all use that area? I mean, we had wars and shit like that, but obviously we're going to have wars. We're humans than anybody else. But at the end of the day, it was more of like our governance structures were consensus based, right? And you can't really, when you compare that to capitalism, which is me first and the gimmies, I want to be on top. I want to climb that mountain and be at the top of the heap, right? Our nations didn't work like that. The Innu nation didn't work like that. It was gather around, and if someone disagreed or if a group disagreed, then it wasn't just too bad, we're going to do it anyway. It was let's help you understand what it is that we're trying to do, and we'll try to understand what your view is so that we can move on together and nobody is holding the group back. Very collective.
Yeah, very collective historically. Like you say, very collective historically, and very similar out here on the prairie where we did have general consensus-based governance systems. We knew one another. We advocated for peace and diplomacy. Most of the time, we tried to advocate for that. But like you said, of course, there was always conflict. There's always warfare. So things weren't perfect, but they worked better than things work today for us.
Right. And that comes from the values that we used to teach, right? So when we're talking about education, when you look at education as a treaty right, a lot of people think, okay, well, that means I get funding for school, or I get to attend universities and be relatively unbiased against or whatever, right? When you look at the treaty right to education, to me, that means you're sitting with your elders, you're learning your stories, you're learning your ceremonies, you're learning where the best medicines are out on the land, right? You're learning about why that rock is considered sacred. Why is this area not used for certain things, right? Like Chinaha Nation out in BC had that court case against the grizzly bear spirit mountain. Developers wanted to create a ski resort on this mountain, and the Chinaha people were saying, well, no, the grizzly bear spirit lives there. And that went into their court, but it shows you the complete contrast between how land is viewed. Like it's not just our land, and it's not just our children's land, it's our, the spirits that are with us. And we learn things from that. And to me, that's like our education system. Being on the trap line with your uncles or your grandfathers or your fathers, being out hunting for like weeks at a time or months at a time even. That was all education.
And then so through that concept and paradigm, the treaty right to education and engage in peaceful and diplomatic relationships with the other party on the other side, we should by rights then have the freedom and the autonomy to maintain that education system.
not just that we should, it's that we do. Like we absolutely still have that sovereignty. There's nothing in any of the numbered treaties that say anything about the surrendering of our governance to be ruled over by the Queen. Nothing. Not even in the negotiation. So what happened was, instead of, like, our treaty was signed in 1875, Treaty 5 was signed in 1875, and then in 1876, the colonial government created the Indian Act. But there's no mention of the treaties in the Indian Act.
Yeah, why are there no mention of treaties in the Indian Act? Because if they're so foundational to our nationhood and to the presence of Canada, why wouldn't they mention them in the Indian Act?
I look at it this way. The only reason Canada exists is because we made treaties permitting Canada to exist where they exist, right? And that shows governance, and that shows sovereignty. But then they impose this Indian Act, and they come in and say, well, we're not going to treat your women with respect as leaders. So we're going to elect a headman or a chief, or we're going to suggest that you elect, or we're going to impose this system so that you do elect one figure. That changes the whole power dynamic between how our nations used to cooperate with each other or coexist.
So let's unpack treaties. Because for me as a PhD candidate and student, I always encounter like settlers, or I always even encounter some of our own people who assume that treaties are an extension of colonialism, that they're land surrenders and things like that. But let's unpack it from our Indigenous perspective, especially for the listeners who are not familiar with what those are and how they are.
All right, well, let's imagine you're part of your community and you hear that the government of Canada wants to make a treaty with you, and there's reasons for you to want to coexist. There's reasons for you to not want to coexist. So you and your nation show up to this treaty negotiation.
Yeah, and then from the context of like treaties with the Crown, there is a very specific reasoning behind why they had to have treaties with us.
Because the Royal Proclamation really set up how the treaty process occurred. And the Royal Proclamation says that you have to have a consensus of the people from the Indigenous nation before you take up a settlement.
Yeah, and then that decision to do that didn't come from like one authority figure, because we have multiple people involved in our nationhood from multiple perspectives and multiple dynamics within our nations.
So it wasn't at all. It wasn't like, oh, I'm going to go talk to the chief, and the chief said, I could build my cottage here. It was nothing like that. But when our nations went to the treaty, we didn't bring pen and paper. We brought our pipes, we brought our ceremonies, and we brought our elders. And for us, that treaty is written into the pipe, into those ceremonies, right? And it bothers me that there's a Treaty 7 pipe that sits in the Royal Ontario Museum behind glass. And I was taught that pipe is now suffocating because it's not where it's supposed to be.
Yeah, and you're really getting into like the spirit and intent and the cosmology we brought into our treaty making processes. And this differs greatly from what Canada teaches and how settlers interpret treaties and how they even look at, the historical treaties 1 to 11.
So what Canada has come to rely on and what they teach people is that there's a written treaty. They don't talk about the oral history of the treaty. They don't talk about our perspective of the treaty. They just say, this is the written text. And because it's written in the text that we cede and surrender all things to the Queen, then they cede and surrender all things to the Queen. But if you talk to some of the elders within our nations, they say, no, those words were never used. Those words were never written down. There's speculation, some of it partially proven. I haven't seen it myself, so I can't really verify it. But there's speculation that when the treaties went back to Ottawa, scribers in Ottawa were like, I don't like the way that sounds. Let's make it clear. Absolute surrender. So what Canada is relying on and what they teach us all is nothing more than their unilateral interpretation of the treaty. And they miss that whole aspect of it.
Yeah, and they flipped that narrative to, conquer and take over the land when we had a different intention of coming together.
We entered into the treaty as a peace and, well, we call it peace and friendship, but the spirit and intent was to share the land, right? Like, for God's sakes, our chiefs weren't sitting there going, yeah, you know what, take everything and we'll just live in this quiet little pocket of land that we can't really use. Congratulations, Canada, you did it.
Yeah, I like how you said that our leadership, or that Indigenous leadership in treaties, didn't sit there and say take it all, because even just from like the logical human standpoint, that just doesn't make sense. Like, who in their right mind would agree to surrendering, traditional hunting lands and territories that you depend on for survival?
Yeah, like I've stood out on high peaks or on waterways, and I've looked out on everything that our ancestors would have been responsible for. And be like, how could anybody have it in their mind that, yeah, no, go ahead, take it for nothing, for $5 a year, maybe some twine and maybe some ammunition. Like it's just completely, like you said, it's completely illogical. But that's Canada's logic, right? And for me, that's why I can't identify as Canadian. I'd like to. I think what our ancestors were signing into treaty was to create a great nation. But what happened was Canada said, okay, we're treaty partners, and kind of shoved us into the back pocket and left us the most impoverished people in all of the land that our ancestors thrived on for centuries.
Yeah, that's Canada's logic. And out here on the prairie, like in rural Saskatchewan and like, well, Treaty 6 territory, that logic like exists in just the average dinner table conversations that settlers have where, yeah, they say, well, they sold the land for like $5 a year, or they sold the land for a box of bullets. So kind of feeds into that stereotype and that stereotype that we're not a smart people. But then how you're explaining treaty and you're unpacking this for us and saying, no, there was peace and friendship intentions. There was, ceremonial concepts brought to these conversations, and Canada reinterpreted that to their benefit. It makes a lot of sense because a lot of people don't realize that. Like a lot of people don't have access to hearing what you're sharing with us right now.
Yeah, that's true. Like I've been to some communities where we've given engagement talks, and even the older people have been like, I've never heard this before. But that's no fault of our own people either. That's Canada's education system has, like I said, we entered treaty, but they didn't legislate the treaty. They legislated the Indian Act, which they prescribed themselves control over us.
And there is this assumption today that the Indian Act is treaty. Really, they're two different things entirely. So you hear people critiquing what they think is treaty, but they're actually critiquing what the Indian Act has done.
Yeah. I hate the Indian Act. There's no other act in all of Canada that says this is how we treat this race or this group of people. Nothing. There's only the Indian Act. And we all get cards that we carry around in our pockets to prove that Canada has set us aside from the rest, but under an oppressive control.
Yeah, and it seems like some people get too caught up in like defending what we have access to through the Indian Act, and really there's a bigger picture in play here in terms of our nationhood and the systems that we could establish. But in terms of Treaty 1 to 11, we're talking about like peace and diplomacy in context to, I guess, like the northern part of North America. And here there's a very specific treaty discourse. Like we're talking about here, there's a treaty cultural peace and friendship and even diplomatic discourse in play that, a lot of communities in Treaty 1 to 11 maintain and advocate for. But what distinguishes Treaty 1 to 11 concepts from other treaties that, like a Western white trained lawyer or even like an American lawyer or an international lawyer may not fully be aware of?
I think it was progressively learned how to subjugate us over their time. Like they started with the peace and friendship treaties out in Mi'kmaq territory, and then it went into the Tuvero Wampum territory, and then the Robertson-Huron treaties in North and South Ontario, basically. And then when they got to us, they were like, well, because there was always disputes, right? People in Mi'kmaq territory would say, no, our agreement isn't about this. And the Mohawks would say, no, this isn't what our treaty was. And the Anishinaabe would say, no, this isn't what our treaty was. So when they got to us, I think their idea was to write it down so it would be inarguable. And that, to me, that's one of the more distinguishing parts, was that there's a fully typed out script for each nation that was involved in the making of treaties, the treaties 1 through 11. I work for the project office for the Summit of Treaty 5 Sovereign Nations. So we're specific to Treaty 5, and that's my ancestral territory too. So,
and how is it working for your nation with these conversations in play where you're actually looking at nationhood and looking at sovereignty and operating from that place?
It's super, super rewarding to be involved in those kinds of discussions.
Yeah. And then for me, like to position myself in the conversation, I'm coming at things from Treaty 6 territory. And again, we have our oral histories and cultural practices tied to that peace and diplomacy and friendship project. But at the same time too, like I like how you highlighted that Canada was learning in the process of treaty making as they moved west, and then ultimately through treaty, in the numbered treaty areas, they began to really structure it in a more like written formal way. So all the pomp and things like that, because we have stories of sitting at the treaty negotiations, and there's a lot of pomp, like a lot of flair and things like that when Alex Morris would have these negotiations and meetings with us. But then also too, like on our narrative side of things, we have stories of where we were also learning how to engage in negotiations, the Crown, and how to sort of get into these discussions in a way that could be beneficial for us. And we knew that there was wars taking place in the South and in the Southern Plains, and even the Dakota War of the 1860s, and that there was very real conflicts with these people if things didn't work out, and that they were capable of violence. Like, that didn't escape us. And then I think like some people tend to not take that into consideration. They tend to assume that we were beaten down people already. But no, it was actually, you know, in Treaty 6 and in a lot of the treaty territories, our nations were strong and they were resilient. Residential school wasn't a thing at that time per se for our people. So they're politically and consciously and culturally aware. And then they engaged in these in good faith to try and create some sort of project where peace and friendship and diplomacy could exist uninhibited. But like you're saying, it didn't work out that way.
No, and I think our people learned from other people's experiences too. Like in the prairies down south, there was a little encouragement from that to try to extend peace to the settler nations, as opposed to like having them come up here with their Gatling guns. Like we sometimes hear like, oh, we were starving people. We were just weak and wounded and starving. And to some degree that did exist. And to another degree that existed at the hand of Canada, who refused to extend assistance to us, right? Even though we taught them how to survive in the lands and make use of our resources, when we needed their help, they turned their back on us. And part of the treaty for me is like we can't just watch them take everything. So let's make an agreement with them that says we're all going to be one nation. And I use that term loosely. Like, I don't really think that the ancestors were like, yeah, let's all become Canadian. I really don't think so. And when you talk to the elders, they confirm that.
Yeah, and I agree. I do know that there was intention in there was obviously intention in treaty making, and there was obviously an intention to sort of secure a pathway forward together in a way that may not have been tried elsewhere in the Americas, because colonization in the Americas was really brutal. And you look at the historical records and you look at history in general, and there was very aggressive plays by settlers to conquer the land and the people that are there. And America was full of violence during this time. And I've always heard as it was a goal for us to secure our livelihood and to secure a way forward to live a healthy life without the threat of violence or without the threat of having to defend yourself and engage in warfare over an extended period of time.
There's a treaty clause to continue in the eradication of life. And that clause isn't just what Canada's interpreted. Again, this is how Canada controls the narrative, right? Eradication of life means hunting, fishing, trapping. And I'm like, well, no, our avocation, our way of living includes our governance structures, includes our education systems, it includes our views of a relationship with the land and our responsibility to that land. And those are things that Canada can't legislate. They can't legislate for us because in the treaty, the clause that says continue in their avocation of life, that means our ability to maintain our governance. Because remember, again, there was nothing in the treaty that said you surrender your life to our ways. There was nothing like that. So continuing in our avocation of life, which is a written portion of the text of the treaty, coupled that with the oral history of our nations, the avocation of life means we have every right to continue in our own governance structures, to write our own legislation if we choose to write our own legislation, or continue on in an oral. Many states exist without a formal written constitution. They have written laws, but they don't necessarily have a written constitution.
Yeah, and it's really cool you highlighted that, because in a previous podcast, we talked about how constitutions in Canada and the U.S. sort of have this like supreme, almost like universal law type feel to it, where you can't go in and rewrite them, or you can't go in and adjust them. And Chile in the South is rewriting their constitution. And I think France wrote their constitution over a few years, and in 2008 they amended it multiple times. So they actually went in and amended the constitution. Canada and the US, for some reason, like constitutions are just like some sort of like real big deal. And there's also like a push for our communities to have to write their own constitutions and sort of come up with those sort of governing documents. How is the Canadian Constitution a problem in the treaty conversation that we're having here?
Canada came in and wrote this constitution, put Section 9125 in there and said, yep, we now rule over the Indians. But you can't rule over people without a surrender. And you can't rule over people without defeating them in warfare. Like those are the international laws behind it. But again, in terms of like an international view of the treaties, without a doubt, they're international treaties. But Canada has treated them domestically. But there's a falsehood to that. Like, how can you treat nation-to-nation relationships as something domestic? Canada needed our permission to settle on the lands. That shows that we weren't subject to Canada. So the domestic treaty view is completely, asinine, ridiculous. I'd say it's completely ridiculous because you can't make treaties with your subject. Like Canada is not going to make treaties with Toronto, right? Because Toronto is already part of that whole system. We were never part of that system, even after treaty. And that's what proved our sovereignty at an international level.
And then this is where the UN comes into play, because even with the UN discourses, there's some problems.
The United Nations is all a bunch of bedfellows, primarily made up of colonial states. Well, maybe not primarily, but with several colonial states involved: Australia, New Zealand, America, Brazil. And none of them have really appreciated or respected the Indigenous ways of being. So they haven't considered us states. We do fit the definition of states. We have our own territory. We have our own languages. We have our own culture. We have commonalities within our own people. And we have our own way of governing. What Canada's done is they've imposed this Indian Act, which says, no, you govern according to how we tell you to govern.
Yeah, and you're giving us a lot to unpack and reflect on here, because a lot of people don't know this, and a lot of people aren't aware of, the political ramifications of treaty and Indigenous nationhood here in Canada and in treaty territories.
And the other thing about treaties is one of the reasons why we encounter so many people who don't know anything about the treaties. I think in 1929, 1930, they instituted a law that said lawyers cannot represent Indigenous issues, especially on terms of land. And that went on for, let's say, a good generation or two, which means there was no way for us to fight Canada, even through their own legal system. And they weren't coming to our legal systems to make amends. So there was no way for us to argue with Canada that they're not honoring the treaty, because their whole system made it illegal for us to even have a voice. So then you've got generations of people saying, what happened? All of a sudden their laws changed and we were allowed to, again, quote unquote, allowed to have representation within their system. And all these land claims started popping up by the numbers. And then you've got all this Canadian population saying, well, where the hell are they? Why do they just suddenly want the land? It's not that we suddenly wanted it back. It's that we finally had access to some form of justice to get that land back. And again, justice is its own misused term, right? Like we're going to the oppressor state through the oppressor system that's intended to uphold that oppressive system. And we're saying, hey, recognize our sovereignty.
Yeah, and there's definite ironies there that we have to be aware of too, but we'll probably have to unpack that land claim stuff in another podcast. So what would happen, like in the most ideal world, if Canada said, okay, your sovereign nations figure it out and we'll do the nation to nation thing?
And if Canada does that, then we get access to our resources back. We get governance structures and jurisdiction over not just our children, but our ways of being, our use of the land, our use of the way that we treat animals. They lose a lot of what they think is their power.
Yeah, and this is the ongoing battle that's taking place is simply just like trying to get people aware of these conversations again. In the wake of residential school, in the wake of Indian Act, in the wake of, Canadian assimilation and just like the societal culture that makes it easy for us to forget who we are and where we come from in the political sense.
And it's always been an uphill battle, but I think it's the awareness, I think now, even from 10 years ago, like with your podcast, for example, people are finally talking about these things, putting it out as not as education, but as like truth, as information. And that's what I tried to do with social media. As opposed to like posting pictures of my meals every day. I would post something that was like, has anybody ever thought about why our ancestors would take all of Creator's land and say, give it to Canada? We understood our responsibility, so we couldn't give that up.
Yeah, I like how you said that too. And like for me, growing up in Treaty 6 territory, we heard very similar narratives around treaty, around nationhood, around the Canadian project to assimilate and colonize us and how it's been ongoing. And then I think when I got into like university and my grad school program in Canada and just looking at Twitter and when Twitter blew up, and then you kind of started to notice people from other territories who had similar narratives, who had similar like cultural and political understandings around nationhood, and that was really cool to see. And I think that's how we did meet is through social media, where I started to see your posts on sovereignty and nationhood and things like that.
Yeah, same thing. And we're reaching each other, and that's great. We're strengthening each other, but we're not really getting that message to people whose ears are already closed, right? And for me, this is where, when I went through law school, there was very little information about treaties. Because I was constantly raising my hand in class, and, well, this is injustice, and this is wrong, and that's not my viewpoint, and that's not how I understand things. But I think if I went to law school 20 years earlier, I'd be silenced or hushed. But when I attended, people were more open to that truth, and I think that's great. Like that's whereas before there would have been 20 students out of 200 who would have listened. Now there's maybe 100 and 150 who actually listen, right? And that's a sign of change. I think people are starting to really understand the concept that no, we did not surrender, and the only reason we're considered Canadian is because Canada tells you that we're Canadian.
Yeah, I have a friend who just found our podcast and found an episode I did with Southpaw, a podcast based out of Los Angeles. They do a mixed martial arts podcast and tied into politics, and they had me on there to talk about decolonization. And I shared it on my social media, and she clicked it and listened, and we became friends because she was going through this realization of the politics that she may not have been introduced to and that she wasn't introduced to in law school. And I mean, I hope you're out there, Jasleen, listening to this, and that this journey that you're on in particular is really is something that really needs to happen, that people need to go through this process of almost re-educating themselves to the truth and the real history of what took place here historically. And you're also right when you say that, things are changing slowly and gradually, and I hope they change in time for our benefit. But I also have another student that I used to work with who is in law school now and wrote a paper about treaty nationhood and Indigenous sovereignty, and she's settler, and she was talking about how we have to give how Indigenous people have sovereignty and they have autonomy, and that has to be respected, and that we should just start backing off as a settler Canadian state. And she got good reviews on it, and that was surprising for me to hear. But she also did say, it was the older lawyers, the older dude lawyers who were really turned off by her paper and didn't really see much value in it. But the younger people coming up are starting to sort of see that we need to have these conversations and figure out a way to navigate through. And I think she won an award for that paper. I think she won like some sort of award for it. This just speaks to how Canadians don't hear these narratives, and they just assume that the Canadian state's positive and awesome. And then when they go get their education, they realize, that, well, I hope they realize that, because I know she was going through the process of realizing that the law system that she was invested in and the political system she was invested in and taught to be invested in ultimately was still causing problems for Indigenous people.
Yeah, totally. That's why I chose not to practice law. I didn't complete the bar system for a couple of reasons. For me personally, law school was great. I learned a lot, but I learned a lot on how the non-Indigenous people view the world and how they think. But I also learned how they create laws, and those types of things I can bring back to my nation. But what I couldn't ever do was subscribe to the idea that Indigenous powers, political or otherwise, come from the Indian Act. And that's something I would forever choke on, because I grew up understanding Indigenous people as sovereign nations oppressed by a Canadian system. And the last thing I could do was file a complaint to the court and say, we make our bylaws based on the Indian Act. No, we make our laws based on our inherent sovereignty, which was never lost. And for me, that's why I couldn't practice it. So I turned my strengths to try to rebuild our own nations through governance, through justice, through whatever the direction of the actual community members is, right?
Yeah, and I feel very similar. Like I'm dedicating my work and my projects to, building up our nationhood again and creating, the infrastructure and the scaffolds we need to be strong again. And for me, like that's really rooted in the nation to nation relationship. Like I for me, I personally don't care what Canadians do on that side of the equation, but I want them to respect what we do on this side of the equation and the relationship. So how is the treaty nation to nation relationship? How does it have real political implications? Because it does. What are the implications for like a realized or a reestablished nation to nation relationship today?
The benefits to everybody would just be substantial. I don't have any question about that at all. If you honor the treaty, which says we share the land, then you're saving all this money in court battles. Canada is not saying here's $2 billion for housing. We have access to our own resources. We can build our own. Funny little anecdote on that was when Twitter did blow up. Remember that whole Education Act that was coming out? Well, when that came out, I was working as a funding and program development for a First Nation child welfare organization, and I got sent to this thing to learn about a recreation grant. But it was something that the Governor General Johnston, I think his name was. It was under his envelope, so he was there promoting it. So we're sitting in this room, and this security guy comes in and goes, "Well, before the Governor General comes in, I want you to all just sit still, be careful, like don't do anything jumpy or anything like that. Don't be suspicious. Listen to him respectfully. Applaud if you can at the end, and then we'll be on our way." So very like, who the hell's this guy? So he comes in with his entourage and he gives his little spiel and he leaves. And after his little talk, I went and I sat out in the hall, and I was just sitting there minding my own business, and I see him walking up the hall with his entourage, and I think, it'd be funny if I got a picture of this guy, sent it to my dad. I went up, I approached him, I said, "Hey, do you mind if I get a picture of you?" And he goes, "Oh yeah, well, who's your dad?" So I tell him it's Mercredi, and his eyes light up because my dad was pretty progressive in his day, still is, still very active. Indigenous people don't retire, eh? We can't, we have too much. So anyway, at one point the Attorney General says, "Well, walk with me." I'm like, okay. So I'm walking with this guy, and he turns to me out of the blue and he says, "Well, what do you think of the Education Act?" In the presence of the Governor General, he's supposed to be some sort of pressure of what you say and whatnot, but I don't really ever subscribe to that kind of thing. And I just flat out told him, I said, "You know what? I don't like it." He goes, "Well, what don't you like about it?" And I said just what I said earlier. I said, "Well, the treaties recognize our inherent right to education. So you shouldn't be making an Education Act for the Indigenous people. We should have our own Indigenous Education Act. We can create these things ourselves. And if the treaties were honored, then you would recognize that." So he just goes, "Well, don't you want the money?" And I said, "Well, again, if the treaties were honored, we wouldn't even need to ask for money. We'd have access to the same resources that you took from us, except we'd have abilities to say what we're going to use those resources for. And if we did profit, if we benefited from the treaty as our ancestors intended for us, then we would have the access to build our own education systems, our own institutions, and we wouldn't need Canada to give us any quote-unquote generous handouts."
Yeah, so to this guy, you were just sitting in the hall there chilling, and he figured he could, talk with you and maybe you would kind of agree with what he had to say in the moment, but then you break it down for him. And then so when you broke it down for Governor General Johnston at the time, what was his response to this?
And he says, well, change it. And I said, "Well, I intend to." But that's how ingrained that idea of the suppression of Indigenous sovereignty is. Like, this is the Governor General of Canada who's supposed to represent our interest as much as Canada's interest, supposed to know the treaty and honor that treaty. But they view it as nothing more than a cede and surrender. And they don't look beyond that written word. That's what they know is true.
But I mean, that story just speaks to like the settler colonial belief system that they have to erode who we are. And they have to erode what we establish through peace and diplomacy, through treaty, like the structure and the system of nation to nation and sharing the land, sharing resources. And you're laying that out, how that's important and vital and still in play. But it's almost like they're consciously trying to assimilate and erode what our ancestors established and just basically integrate us into, the political system, the economic system. And like, even just the fact that he said, "Well, don't you want the money?" It just speaks to like the underlying intention. And like, even if you just look at like our resources and our territories, like the money that is being offered through the settler state is nickels and dimes compared to what's really out there. And what we legitimately, have access to, not to monetize the land in any way, But I mean, if we just put it in that comparison of currency, the way some people could understand it and think about it.
Well, I think also this, when Indigenous nations say we have our own governance structures, and we do, Canada has INAC, or Indigenous Services Canada, and whatever that reconciliation party is now. And that is a tremendous amount of money being flowed through that administration office, right? Well, we're First Nations people, we should be able to administer those funds ourselves. So when you honor the treaty and you let go of this control factor that you have, that you pay your own citizens to help control the Indigenous populations, you eradicate that, flow the money through this actual mutually beneficial agreement, sharing in the bounty and benevolence, like the treaty promises. And then I'd be amiss if you didn't save a lot of money.
So you're highlighting this nation-to-nation agreement, and you're highlighting the importance of treaty and our concepts around treaty and our intention with it. And then also you're highlighting, how the settler Canadian state is actively attempting to erode that for their own interest. But even for our podcast audience, we do have listeners who are settlers who are invested in settler colonial political systems even. Yeah, just general Canadian citizens going about their day, living their daily life, reaping the benefits of colonialism at the cost of our people. How do we contextualize the treaty relationship to them when they hear this for the first time?
I would say delicately, but I don't really care for delicately either. All Canadians need to understand that there was an agreement between several nations of people that helped Canada become what Canada is. All of the benefits that they receive from Canada, like a healthcare system, which is funded by the resources on the land, all of that comes from our pocket. Right? It's the injustice on us that we cannot access any of the economy that makes Canada one of the richest countries in the world. It's a willful ignorance.
Yeah, and that ignorance comes from not understanding nation-to-nation treaty and Indigenous nationhood.
Settler nations really need to understand that we aren't Canadian. Because again, you can't make a treaty with your own subjects, which means that we're our own sovereign nations.
And that sovereignty is key. But then at the same time, what do we tell settlers when they start to break it down to how the system's going to work? And I really like what you're saying, because you're giving us some structural analysis of how things should ideally operate, or at least look like. And I know some people are probably going to try to critique what we're talking about and say, well, no, that's not going to work, or it's not going to work like that. But I mean, we're analyzing the problem on the fly, and we're looking at it on the fly. And we should come together and have a conversation about this as Indigenous peoples, obviously. But for the sake of conversation, what do we tell settlers that are asking the question of, well, what are we going to do and how are we going to do it?
I think one of the concerns that I encounter quite often with settler people is well, if you get the land back, what happens to us? I'm like, nothing. You just fall under a different jurisdiction. You just move the state line a little bit. And we're not talking about creating a governance system that, we're fully in control and we're going to kick everybody out and send them all back to England. We can't do that, first off, mostly because it's an impossibility, but also because we have to honor the treaty that we entered into with colonial states in the first. But you hear these land acknowledgements. Okay, that's great. That's one step towards what the truth is. People are saying, this is the traditional lands of the Indigenous people or the Nawa people. I'm like, well, it's not the traditional lands. It's our lands. The very fact that you're standing in a building giving an acknowledgement to the people that have been robbed of the resources that your nation used to construct this building is kind of harmful. And it sets them off in this thing of okay, well, we did a land acknowledgement. I get it. Indigenous people were here. What? No, we weren't. We are. And those claims haven't gone away. I don't know of any claims that it's oh, okay, Canada, yeah, you're right. It's your land now. Nothing. And if we do lose, it's because of bias or partiality in the justice system.
Yeah, that's true too. Because I mean, even with land claims, right? It's still ultimately ours. So even if there is losses or it's being stalled, it's still technically ultimately ours.
Yeah, it totally is. I mean, my neighbor has a picnic table. I can't go into my neighbor's yard, take that picnic table, put it up in my yard and tell him that it's mine. And then if he comes to me and says, well, let's resolve this, and I say there's only one way to resolve that, and that's through my opinion of it, then he's not going to get any justice. And if that's something as small as a picnic table, and everybody would recognize that as completely unfair of me to do that. But that's what Canada does with our timber, with our fish, with our muskrat, like everything. They think they own it all.
And then for Treaty 6 territory here, it's agribusiness, like it's agriculture. Canola being the main, export for Canada. Technically speaking, that's a resource from our territory that we should have a right to not only farm and live a lifestyle where we could sustain our own economy, but it's ours.
Well, and benefit from, right? Like when you're talking about the sharing of the bounty of the land, the sharing in the bounty and benevolence, you have this maybe, let's say half of Saskatchewan. Well, half of it, everywhere that there's a treaty, and if you outline the treaty, I'll talk about Manitoba because I know more about it. But Treaty 5 covers the vast majority of the north of Manitoba. That's all treaty land. So all of that land is under an international agreement to share.
Yeah, and a lot of people theorize this, like how would it look when these relationships start to actually look how we intended them to look. And I know a lot of people theorize it from different perspectives, and that Treaty 6 sort of gives Canada it means that Canada has to, I'm trying to say this without getting tone police because I know there's a lot of jargon and there's a lot of legalese involved in these conversations, but it's like Canada has to uphold their obligation through the Crown to provide to us what we agreed to. A lot of people theorize how this would actually look. How would this look in your eyes, in your perspective?
Maybe it's just a calculation thing. Maybe Canada just says, okay, well, this is our treaty. This is what the area of the land that you used. Then if we're extracting timber from that, then you get a percentage of that. And it should be as easy as designing or prescribing. It should be as easy as prescribing calculations as far as economy goes, right? But then beyond that, you can't just say, okay, well, great. We have all these extractions happening and we're getting our benefits from it. We're getting, like, look at the gross domestic product of each province. They're in the billions. And First Nations people are still the most impoverished, and we have to wait for handouts just to build houses. It's ridiculous. But beyond that, beyond the whole funding issue, is the jurisdiction of it. Like, okay, if we share the land, then we also have to share the responsibility of that land. And that's what I believe our ancestors were trying to set us up for. Like, we will have a say in everything that occurs on this land in a coexisting relationship with the settler nation. But it was like, oh, well, we're putting a train here, so everything within miles of that train is now ours, and we can do what we want with it. We'll extract the land, and that's all ours. It's not the way it's supposed to be.
Yeah, and you provide this interesting argument and conversation where, okay, we're living here with the settler state, and there's sort of like a clash of paradigms and a clash of systems. But there's always, like, even in decolonial conversations, there's always this assumption that we're going to erase the state or we're going to send them all back to the boat. And you said earlier, that's not necessarily the case because we have treaty that brings us into a relationship together to find peace, diplomacy, friendship, and coexist with one another. So how does it look like legally in your eyes, from your perspective?
There's fundamentally no reason to not coexist. I mean, even when Indigenous people make their own law, they're not saying, like, it's not in contrast with Canadian laws. Like, let's assume Treaty 5 gains jurisdiction over their whole governance, right? So they have jurisdiction over their lands. Well, there's still highways that exist through those territories. It's not like we're going to look at those territories and say, well, as soon as you enter into what is now known as Treaty 5 territory, our speed limit changes to 120.
Yeah, and then you switch over to the other side of the road. Just drive on the other side.
Yeah, something like that, right? I mean, why would we do that? Let's say criminal law. It's not going to, just because you enter our territory doesn't mean like, oh, okay, well, all of a sudden stealing is fine. What would differ in that territory would be the way that those the thieves were managed, or the thieves were handled. Like, Canada likes throwing us in jail, but we like being corrective. And they call it a correction facility, but it's a punitive in nature, right? Whereas we had the more reconciliatory based models. So it's like, if you wronged this person, correct your behavior, make right with that person, and then continue on. And that's what that peaceful coexistence is. It ensures, like, our communities were so small that, like, if you and I grew up in the same community and say I stole something from you, it wouldn't make sense for us to, here, I'll give you $20 for what I stole and move on, because you still hold a grudge. And our justice system goes deep enough to say, let's work on not having that grudge exist anymore, right? Whereas Canada's just like, oh, you did wrong? Okay, well, compensate for them and move on.
Yeah, bro, you've given us a lot to think about here, and just how you're talking about it. Really, I think for a lot of people, they're going to be hearing this for the first time in this way, and I think I'm going to have to stop here. And I really want to get you on again, you know, as the momentum grows and things, and we could have more in-depth conversations. Because again, like, even over here in Treaty 1 to 11 meetings and Treaty 6 meetings, you know, when you sit with old people, these narratives and these conversations could happen for a really long time, because there's a lot of information in there. There's a lot of context in these conversations, and we're packing this into like an hour-long podcast, and this is just introductory. Is there anything else you want to add that is primary and vital that our listeners understand when we have conversations about treaty and nation to nation and the presence of the settler state?
One more point. I just want to make one more point. It's in Canada's constitution, they didn't say no mention of treaties within their constitution or any of their laws up until 1982. And then when it finally got into the constitution under Section 35, we recognize the inherent and treaty rights of Indigenous people. They haven't defined, and they can't define, what those inherent rights are. That's only something that we can define. One of my favorite papers in law school, and one of my lowest marked papers actually, was to my advanced constitutional law prof. And my paper was the unconstitutionality of Section 35. Because what Section 35 does is it assumes that we're Canadian citizens. It doesn't allow us to the actual inherent and treaty right of sovereignty. So every time we have a right, we go through Canada's court systems for their opinion on whether or not our opinion is strong enough to exist on this land, right? And if our opinion is that we're sovereign people, then there has to be a different way of adjudicating that. And I hope people set their minds to what that could look like. That's what the nation to nation is. The nation to nation isn't, okay, let's do everything Canada's way. That's unilateral and oppressive. The nation to nation is the same way that we deal with France, the same way that we deal with China. I'm not an international legal expert or anything like that, but I do know that we're not Canadian, except for the assumed authority Canada has.
And like for me in my work, that's why I position a lot of my governance conversations and nationhood building projects from the simple linguistic perspective of diplomacy. And that requires more of a diplomatic process, like you say, between nations than it does from the perspective of having to compromise to the settler state.
And to speak to that, to our own nation, we as Innu, as Mi'kmaq, as Anishinaabe, we really have to understand what our treaties were from our perspective. Because if we say we want treaty rights through a colonial perspective, then those aren't treaty rights. And the treaty doesn't grant us our rights. The treaty guarantees our rights as sovereign nations, right? And that's a perspective that I think people need to focus in on a little bit more. It's not a separatist kind of argument. It's a coexistence argument.
Yeah, and I think like for me too, when I encountered a lot of lefties just because I was an instructor in university, and they always were looking at leftist theory, I guess, and to me, like, the left and the right always want to recruit Indigenous people. Like, they always actively try to recruit Indigenous people to justify their own projects. And to me, that's all settler colonial because it's not ours. But what I was going to say is there's the assumption that they want a revolution. And to me, it's like, why? Because to me, we didn't even really get the nation to nation agreement to begin with. Like, we didn't get our political project to start with. So when you talk about a revolution, what are you talking about? Because we're not going to reset to the 1800s, but we already have a treaty. Like, why can't we just invest time into establishing what we want to establish and see how it unfolds and come together and have these conversations? And that's more radical in my eyes than drawing on 19th century European philosophies that are very specific to a region, right? And like, even for me, like, I just found out recently that even the term anarchist and socialism's a relatively new term. So that doesn't really even apply to me to say I'm a socialist, because, you know, those political constructs are newer they're more recent than how long our indigenous nations have been established here in this territory.
Yeah, we are pre-colonial nations, right? And we exist still.
Yeah, I kind of think I when I did that leftist podcast, I think people identified me as being like a communist or a socialist, but I critique both from the perspective of indigenous nationhood.
And I think that's its own category.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, I think, and that has to be that. Why can't it be its own category? Communism is a non-indigenous term, and socialism is a non-indigenous term. Utilitarianism is, those aren't our terms. And like religion, I kind of suggested earlier that I don't prescribe to the terms religion for our cultural or spiritual beliefs, because it's just a practice. It's just how we did things. It's who we are and how we know ourselves. As soon as what you've mentioned quite a bit is the narrative. Well, who's controlling that narrative? And why, if we know that Canada has done so much wrong to Indigenous people, would we continue to believe their narrative about Indigenous people? This is what my problem with UNDRIP is. And it complements your previous comment, is that UNDRIP is an international law that was developed within the last couple of decades. But there's nothing in UNDRIP that we don't already have from treaty, like not necessarily the written text of the treaty, but through the oral accounts of our treaty, through our understanding of the treaty. Like, they say we should have jurisdiction over the land. Well, we never lost jurisdiction over the land. They say we should have the right to protect our children. Like, we never lost that right. So UNDRIP's kind of like a I don't know. I don't want to call it like a renegotiation of a treaty, but it averts from the attention of actually implementing the treaty in its true sense.
Yeah, and UNDRIP is really like promoted in university 107s or introductory to Indigenous studies classes as something that's really cool. But what you say is correct. And UNDRIP is ultimately designed for, Indigenous or oppressed people who don't have a treaty. And we already have that. We already have what those people are trying to negotiate and get established.
And what it's no more powerful than the treaty. It's definitely not more powerful, because Canada still wants to implement it according to their constitution. I mean, if you didn't put our treaties in the constitution, then you can't put UNDRIP into our constitution. Try putting the treaties into your constitution truthfully, through our perspective, how we understand the true spirit and intent of the treaty, and then we can talk about what UNDRIP means. What it means to us, right? Some people love it, some people live by it, but I'm like, well, I haven't seen anything in UNDRIP that wasn't already answered in 1875.
Yeah. And of course, like, we know with the settler state, they're not going to do that, right? They're not going to actually like try and create a governance system on their side that's going to acknowledge our governance system. But like with what you're saying here, we need to theoretically explore these conversations and have these types of discussions for young people to hear, so they could begin to figure out how that's going to look, because it has to take us somewhere. And I have faith that it will take us somewhere. If people want to find you, where could they find you online?
I kind of hide in the back corner. I don't, what's funny, in my posts, it's like kind of a sidebar, but in my posts, people don't really interact. I assume they agree with me, or they assume they're not going to change my mind, which I'm okay with, because I don't want my mind changed on a lot of things anyway. A lot of time to affirm my conviction of sovereignty. But yeah, I don't know. I'm on Facebook. I post randomly. I've slowed down a little bit recently. But other than that, yeah, I guess Facebook's the only social media that I really use.
I'll link your Facebook profile into the show notes if that's okay.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, man, this is a really good episode. I think a lot of people are going to reflect on this. And I know a lot of young people who are students who listen to this are going to be hearing these conversations for the first time, who are, treaty nationals and descendants of people who were signatories to treaty. And, their ancestors were striving for that nation to nation agreement. But I mean, your perspective is really important. And I really wanted you on the show because you're a type of guy that's doing a lot of the backhouse work, that, is doing work behind the scenes. And I really want to bring people to the forefront and get those perspectives out there. Because we sometimes don't hear and get people. We sometimes don't have access to these conversations because there's a lot of grandstanders out there in Indigenous governance, a lot of showboats, and I don't really like that. I think it does more damage than good. But I'm really glad you're on this podcast sharing this knowledge with us, and I'm really excited to see where it goes.
Yeah, that's right. And I'm not in it for myself. Like genuinely want to see Indigenous people get what is justly theirs.
Yeah, for sure. And again, we'd love to have you back and have more conversations in the future.
I'd be glad to.
Awesome. Great, Jason. I appreciate everything.
Yeah, me too. Thanks so much, Milo. Nice to meet you, by the way.
Yeah, no problem.
Cool.
This episode was produced and mixed by Mylan Tatusis, with additional production support by Dara Lucero and Peyton Jackson. If you like what we do, please like, subscribe, and share. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram at The Radical Narrative Podcast. If you wish to contact us, our website is www.therradicalnarrative.com.